The humid Georgia air clung to my skin like a second layer as I adjusted my black dress for what felt like the 100th time. Standing outside the old Victorian funeral home in Savannah, I could hear the distant sound of church bells mixing with the gentle rustle of Spanish moss in the ancient oak trees. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed down the fabric not from grief, but from the knot of anxiety that had been growing in my stomach for the past 3 days. "You look fine, Rebecca," my husband Thomas muttered without looking at me, his eyes fixed on his phone screen. Even at his own father's funeral, he couldn't put the damn thing away. "Just remember what we talked about. Keep your mouth shut and let me handle everything." I nodded silently, though something inside me bristled at his tone. After 8 years of marriage, I'd grown accustomed to Thomas treating me like an accessory rather than a partner. But today felt different somehow. Maybe it was the weight of saying goodbye to the only person in the Montgomery family who had ever shown me genuine kindness. The funeral home's interior was exactly what you'd expect in old Savannah: dark mahogany panels, crystal chandeliers, and the lingering scent of magnolias mixed with furniture polish. Charles Montgomery lay in the casket looking more peaceful than I'd seen him in years, finally free from the lung cancer that had been eating away at him. At 73, he'd lived through integration, Vietnam, and the slow transformation of Savannah from a sleepy southern town into a tourist destination. I'd met Charles 5 years ago when Thomas finally brought me home to meet his family. While Thomas's sister Patricia looked me up and down like I was something she'd scraped off her shoe, and his mother Eleanor made passive-aggressive comments about my humble background, Charles had taken my hand and smiled warmly. "So you're the teacher who's been making my boy happy," he'd said in that slow, molasses drawl that made every word sound like poetry. "Rebecca, isn't it? Tell me, what grade do you teach?" "3rd grade," I'd replied, surprised by his genuine interest. "Ah, the perfect age. Old enough to think for themselves, young enough to still believe in magic. That's important work you're doing, young lady." From that moment on, Charles became my ally in a family that never quite accepted me. During holiday dinners, when Eleanor would make cutting remarks about my clothes or my family's background, Charles would change the subject or find a way to praise something I'd done. When Patricia would exclude me from conversations about family traditions I supposedly wouldn't understand, Charles would pull me aside to explain the stories behind old photographs or share memories of Savannah's history. The service itself was a blur of hymns and eulogies. Thomas gave a speech about his father's business acumen and community involvement, all very proper and emotionless. Patricia talked about family legacy and tradition. Eleanor dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though I'd never seen her show Charles much affection while he was alive. But it was the moments after the service that I'll never forget. As we prepared to leave for the cemetery, I felt a gentle touch on my shoulder. Turning around, I found myself face to face with Judge William Harper, Charles's oldest friend and longtime chess partner. "Rebecca, might I have a word?" His voice was kind but serious, the same tone I imagined he used in his courtroom. We stepped away from the crowd, and Judge Harper glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Charles spoke of you often, you know. He was very fond of you." "I was fond of him, too," I said, feeling tears threaten for the first time that day. "He was the kindest man I've ever known." Judge Harper nodded slowly. "He saw something in you that I think maybe even you don't see yet. He used to say you had a strength that hadn't been tested yet, but when it was, you'd surprise everyone, including yourself." Before I could ask what he meant, Thomas appeared at my side. "Rebecca, we need to go. The procession is starting." As we walked away, Judge Harper called after us. "I'll see you both tomorrow at 2 o'clock. For the will reading." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded curtly. "Of course." The cemetery service was mercifully brief. Standing graveside in the afternoon heat, listening to the preacher talk about dust returning to dust, I found myself thinking about the conversation with Judge Harper. What had Charles seen in me that I couldn't see in myself? And why did I feel like tomorrow's will reading was going to change everything? As the first shovel of red Georgia clay hit the casket, Thomas leaned close to my ear. His breath was hot against my neck as he whispered, "Just so we're clear about tomorrow, don't get any ideas. You're not blood. You won't be getting anything, so don't embarrass yourself by looking disappointed." I nodded again, but something had shifted inside me during Judge Harper's words. For the first time in years, I felt a tiny spark of something I hadn't felt in so long I'd almost forgotten what it was called. Hope. That evening, as Thomas disappeared into his home office to make business calls, I sat on the back porch of our modest ranch house, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. Charles's house, the grand antebellum mansion on Forsyth Park, where the Montgomery family had lived for 3 generations, sat empty now, waiting for tomorrow's legal proceedings to determine its fate. I thought about all the Sunday dinners I'd attended there, all the times Charles had pulled me aside to show me some family heirloom or share a story about Savannah's past. He treated me like family when his own children treated me like an outsider. Maybe Thomas was right, and I'd inherit nothing but memories. But those memories were worth more than any material possession the Montgomery family could offer. Still, as I prepared for bed that night, Judge Harper's words echoed in my mind. He saw something in you that I think maybe even you don't see yet. Tomorrow, I would find out what Charles Montgomery really thought of the schoolteacher who'd married his son. Little did I know that in less than 24 hours, my entire world would turn upside down. Judge Harper's law office occupied the 2nd floor of a beautiful antebellum building on Bull Street, with tall windows that overlooked one of Savannah's famous squares. The morning sun streamed through the old glass, casting dancing shadows from the oak trees outside across the Persian rugs and leather-bound law books that lined the walls. The scent of old paper and lemon oil gave the place a timeless quality, as if important decisions had been made within these walls for centuries. I'd barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Thomas's voice. Don't get any ideas. You're not blood. But I also kept remembering Charles's kind smile and the way he'd always made me feel like I belonged somewhere I clearly didn't. Thomas had been unusually quiet during breakfast, mechanically eating his eggs and toast while scrolling through his phone. He dressed in his most expensive suit, the charcoal gray one he wore to important business meetings, and his jaw had that tight set it got when he was stressed about money. Which, lately, was most of the time. Remember what I said yesterday, he muttered as we climbed the stairs to Judge Harper's office. Let me do the talking. The waiting area was elegant but comfortable, with the kind of furniture that had been expensive 50 years ago and was now priceless with age. Patricia was already there, dressed in black Chanel and checking her makeup in a compact mirror. She looked up when we entered, her smile as cold as always. Rebecca, she said with false sweetness. How lovely that you're here for this family matter. The emphasis on family wasn't lost on me. Patricia had never let me forget that I was an outsider who'd somehow wormed her way into the Montgomery circle. She'd made it clear from day one that she considered me a gold digger who trapped her brother into marriage. Eleanor arrived moments later, leaning heavily on her walking cane but still managing to look imperious. At 70, she remained the formidable Southern matriarch, her silver hair perfectly styled and her black dress clearly expensive. She nodded curtly at Thomas and Patricia, then looked at me as if she couldn't quite remember why I was there. Shall we begin? Judge Harper emerged from his inner office, looking every inch the distinguished Southern gentleman in his navy suit and bow tie. He'd known the Montgomery family for over 40 years, had been Charles's roommate at the University of Georgia, and had stood as Thomas's godfather. If anyone understood the family dynamics, it was him. We filed into his private office, which was even more impressive than the waiting area. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, oil paintings of hunting scenes, and a massive mahogany desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. Judge Harper took his seat behind the desk, while we arranged ourselves in the leather chairs facing him. Thomas sat closest to the desk, his posture screaming entitlement. Patricia smoothed her skirt and crossed her ankles in that practiced way Southern ladies learn from birth. Eleanor clutched her purse with both hands, her knuckles white with tension. And I sat at the end, feeling like exactly what Patricia had always told me I was an interloper at a family gathering. Before we begin, Judge Harper said, adjusting his reading glasses, I want you to know that Charles spent considerable time on this will. He revised it several times over the past year, and every change was made with careful thought and legal precision. This document reflects his final wishes, made with full mental capacity and without any coercion. He paused, letting that sink in. Something about his tone made my stomach flip. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his businessman's instincts clearly picking up on some undercurrent I couldn't identify. Now then, Judge Harper continued, opening a thick folder. Let's proceed with the reading of Charles Montgomery's Last Will and Testament. The first part was standard stuff: funeral arrangements, charitable donations, personal items. Charles had left his golf clubs to his old buddy at the country club, his collection of Civil War books to the Savannah History Museum, and his beloved 1967 Mustang to his nephew in Atlanta. To my daughter, Patricia Montgomery Sinclair, Judge Harper read, "I leave the sum of $50,000, along with my mother's china set and the family photographs." Patricia's face remained composed, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. 50,000 was nothing to sneeze at, but for someone who'd been expecting much more, it had to sting. To my son, Thomas Montgomery, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of rare bourbon, along with my father's pocket watch. Thomas's reaction was harder to read, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the chair arms. I could practically feel the tension radiating from him. This was not going according to whatever plan he'd had. To my dear wife, Eleanor Montgomery, I leave a sum of $100,000 and the right to remain in the family home for the remainder of her natural life, with all expenses paid from the estate. Eleanor nodded once, sharply. It was generous, but again, probably not what she'd expected from a man who'd built a successful construction company over 40 years. Judge Harper paused and looked directly at me. Thomas must have sensed something because he leaned closer and whispered in my ear, his voice barely audible but dripping with cruel satisfaction, "Don't expect a dime." The words hit me like a physical blow. Even though I tried to prepare myself for exactly this moment, having my husband's contempt laid out so clearly still hurt. I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, determined not to give Patricia the satisfaction of seeing me disappointed. But Judge Harper wasn't finished. He cleared his throat and continued reading, his voice taking on a different tone, warmer, more personal. To Rebecca Montgomery, who brought joy back into my son's life and light back into our family home, who treated an old man with kindness when she had nothing to gain by doing so, who represents the very best of what families should be. My heart stopped. Thomas went rigid beside me. Patricia's mouth fell open slightly, and Eleanor's knuckles went from white to bloodless. Judge Harper looked up at me over his reading glasses, and I swear I saw the hint of a smile. "Rebecca, Charles has left you the remainder of his entire estate. This includes the family home on Forsyth Park, the construction company Montgomery & Sons, all business assets, investment accounts, and properties. The total value, as of the most recent appraisal, is approximately $3.2 million. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I was floating above my body, watching the scene happen to someone else. Thomas's whispered words, "Don't expect a dime," echoed in my head as the reality of what Judge Harper had just said slowly penetrated my shock. $3.2 million. The house where Charles had lived his entire adult life. The business he'd built from nothing. All of it. Left to me. "This is impossible." Patricia was the first to find her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "She's not even family. She's only been married to Thomas for 8 years. "I'm afraid it's quite possible and entirely legal," Judge Harper replied calmly. "Charles was very specific in his reasoning, which he asked me to share with you." He pulled out another sheet of paper, clearly prepared for this reaction. Charles wrote, and I quote, "Rebecca has shown me more genuine care and affection in 5 years than I received from my own children in the previous 68. She listens when I speak, remembers what I tell her, and treats me like a person worth knowing rather than an obstacle to an inheritance. She has earned what I am giving her, not through blood, but through love." Thomas finally exploded. "This is ridiculous. She manipulated him. She's a gold digger who saw an opportunity and—" "Thomas!" Judge Harper's voice cut through the outburst like a blade. "I've known your father for over 40 years. No one manipulated Charles Montgomery. He made this decision with full awareness of its implications and specifically asked me to ensure it would stand up to any legal challenges." The room erupted into chaos. Patricia was demanding to see documentation. Eleanor was muttering about family shame and ungrateful outsiders. Thomas was pacing behind his chair, his face red with rage and disbelief. But I just sat there, numb with shock, thinking about Sunday dinners and chess lessons and the way Charles always asked about my students. Had he really seen something in me that I didn't see in myself? Or had he simply been repaying kindness with kindness, There must be grounds for contesting this, Thomas said, his voice tight with controlled fury. Undue influence, mental incapacity, something. Judge Harper shook his head. Charles anticipated this reaction. He had a full psychiatric evaluation done 6 months ago, confirming his complete mental competency. He also asked me to inform you that any attempt to contest this would result in the contested party forfeiting their bequest entirely. The fight went out of Thomas's shoulders like air from a punctured balloon. $50,000 wasn't much in the context of $3.2 million, but it was still $50,000 he couldn't afford to lose. As the family continued to argue and protest around me, I found myself thinking about the conversation Charles and I had shared just 2 months ago. We'd been sitting on his back porch, watching the sunset paint the Spanish moss gold, and he'd asked me about my dreams. "What would you do?" he'd said. "If money wasn't an object, if you could do anything with your life." I'd laughed, thinking it was just an old man's idle curiosity. "I'd probably open a literacy center," I'd said. "Somewhere kids could come after school to get help with reading, especially kids whose parents work multiple jobs and can't help them. Maybe expand it to include adult education too." Charles had nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like something Savannah could use." Now, sitting in Judge Harper's office while my husband's family fell apart around me, I realized Charles hadn't been making idle conversation. He'd been planning to give someone he trusted the resources to make a difference. The meeting ended with paperwork and legal formalities that I barely understood. Judge Harper assured me he would handle the transfer of assets and that I should take time to process everything before making any major decisions. As we prepared to leave, he handed me an envelope. "Charles asked me to give this to you after the reading," he said quietly. Outside on Bull Street, the normal sounds of Savannah life, tourists chatting, carriage tours clopping by, the distant sound of a street musician felt surreal against the earthquake that had just reshaped my entire existence. Thomas hadn't spoken to me since the reading ended. He walked stiffly beside me toward our car, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. Patricia had stormed out without saying goodbye, and Eleanor had simply stared at me like I was some sort of alien creature she couldn't comprehend. It wasn't until we were in the car that Thomas finally spoke, his voice quiet and dangerous. "I hope you're proud of yourself." I looked at him, this man I'd married 8 years ago, and realized I was seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. The Thomas I'd fallen in love with, or thought I had, was charming and confident. But stripped of his expectations and faced with a situation he couldn't control, all I saw was bitterness and entitlement. "I didn't know," I said quietly. "I had no idea he was going to do this." Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. You just happened to be extra nice to the rich old man, and it just happened to pay off." The accusation hurt more than I expected. Not because it was true, but because it revealed how little my own husband thought of me. In Thomas's mind, I was incapable of genuine affection. Every kindness had to have an ulterior motive. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. As we pulled into our driveway, I looked at our modest ranch house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a mortgage we'd been struggling to pay since Thomas's business had started failing 2 years ago. In a few days, I would own one of the most beautiful mansions in Savannah's historic district. But more than that, I would own my freedom. For the first time since I'd gotten married, I wouldn't have to ask permission or apologize for existing or pretend to be smaller than I was to make someone else feel bigger. As Thomas slammed his car door and stalked into the house without waiting for me, I sat in the driveway and opened Charles's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in his familiar handwriting. "My dear Rebecca, if you're reading this, then you've just discovered that sometimes life surprises us in the most wonderful ways. I hope you understand that this inheritance comes with no strings attached and no expectations beyond this. Be happy. You spent too many years making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. Now you have the freedom to be as large as your dreams. The house has been waiting for someone who will love it properly. The business could use fresh ideas from someone who understands what it means to build something meaningful. But most importantly, you now have the resources to become whoever you were meant to be before life, and other people convinced you to settle for less. Don't let them make you feel guilty for this gift. You earned it with every Sunday dinner conversation, every chess game you let an old man win, every time you chose kindness when you could have chosen indifference. Be brave, Rebecca. The world needs more people like you in positions where they can make a real difference. With love and confidence in your bright future, Charles. Sitting in that driveway, holding a letter from a dead man who'd seen me more clearly than my own husband, I finally understood what Judge Harper had meant. Charles had seen strength in me that I'd never been allowed to show. And now, whether I was ready or not, it was time to find out if he'd been right. The next week felt like living in someone else's life. Every morning I woke up expecting it all to be a dream: the will reading, the inheritance, the look of pure hatred in Thomas's eyes. But each day, reality reasserted itself with lawyers' calls, paperwork to sign, and the slow, surreal process of actually becoming wealthy. Judge Harper had been efficient and thorough. Within 5 days of the will reading, the first accounts had been transferred to my name. I found myself staring at bank statements showing balances I'd never imagined having, trying to comprehend that these numbers represented my life now. The house was the most overwhelming part. Charles had left specific instructions that I should take possession immediately, and Judge Harper had gently but firmly suggested that given the family tensions, it might be wise to do so sooner rather than later. Eleanor had packed her most important belongings and moved in with Patricia, leaving behind a lifetime of memories and 3 generations of Montgomery family history. Standing in the grand foyer of the Forsyth Park mansion for the first time as its owner, I felt like an imposter. The Persian rugs under my feet probably cost more than I used to make in a year of teaching. The crystal chandelier hanging above my head had been imported from France in 1887. And somehow, impossibly, it all belonged to me now. Thomas had moved into the guest bedroom of our ranch house the day after the will reading. He'd stopped speaking to me entirely, communicating only through cold stares and the occasional sarcastic comment. When he thought I wasn't listening, I'd catch him on the phone with Patricia, their conversations hushed and urgent. I didn't need to hear the words to know they were planning something. It was Judge Harper who warned me about the storm coming. "Rebecca," he said during one of our meetings to transfer business assets, "I need you to understand something. The Montgomery family isn't going to accept this quietly. Patricia in particular has already been asking questions about contesting the will." We were sitting in his office again, but this time the atmosphere felt different. Instead of being the outsider watching from the periphery, I was the client, the one whose interests he was protecting. It was a shift I was still getting used to. "But you said the will was solid, that Charles made sure it couldn't be contested." "Legally, yes. But that doesn't mean they won't try. And even if they fail in court, there are other ways to make your life difficult. Patricia has a lot of connections in Savannah society, and she's already been spreading rumors about your relationship with Charles." My stomach clenched. What kind of rumors? Judge Harper's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the distaste in his eyes. The kind that question your motives and suggest inappropriate behavior. None of it's true, of course, and anyone who knew Charles would laugh at such implications. But people love gossip, especially when it involves this much money. I thought about Patricia's cold smile and her emphasis on family during the will reading. Of course, she wouldn't go down without a fight. The Montgomery name meant everything to her, and having a teacher from nowhere inherit the family fortune was probably her worst nightmare. What should I do? Live your life. Make decisions based on what you want, not what they expect. And remember that Charles chose you for a reason. He saw something in you that maybe you're just now starting to see in yourself. That conversation happened on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, I understood exactly what he'd been trying to prepare me for. I was in the mansion's kitchen, a beautiful space with modern appliances discreetly integrated into turn-of-the-century architecture, trying to figure out how to make coffee in Charles's elaborate espresso machine when the doorbell rang. Through the beveled glass panels beside the front door, I could see multiple figures on the porch. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with Patricia, Eleanor, and 3 people I didn't recognize. 2 women and a man, all dressed in expensive clothes and wearing expressions that ranged from curious to hostile. "Rebecca," Patricia said with false brightness, "I hope you don't mind us stopping by. I brought some friends who were just dying to meet Charles's beneficiary." The way she said beneficiary made it sound like something distasteful. I could feel myself shrinking under their collective gaze, falling back into the old patterns of trying to make myself smaller and less threatening. But then I remembered Charles's letter. "You've spent too many years making yourself smaller to fit into spaces that were never meant for you." "Of course. I said, stepping aside to let them in. Please come in. The mansion's interior had the desired effect. I watched their eyes widen as they took in the antique furniture, the oil paintings, the obvious wealth surrounding them. But instead of being impressed with me, they seemed more convinced than ever that I didn't belong there. Lovely, said one of the women, a perfectly coiffed blonde who looked like she'd stepped out of a country club magazine. It's so unchanged. Just like when Charles lived here. Well, of course it is, Patricia said smoothly. Rebecca only just moved in. I'm sure she hasn't had time to redecorate. The implication was clear. When I did redecorate, it would be gaudy and inappropriate, because someone like me couldn't possibly have the taste to maintain a place like this. We made uncomfortable small talk in the front parlor, with Patricia's friends asking seemingly innocent questions that felt loaded with judgment. Where was I from originally? What did my parents do? How had I met Thomas? Each answer seemed to confirm something they'd already decided about me. It was Eleanor who finally dropped the pretense. You know, dear, she said in her carefully modulated southern voice, I've been thinking about Charles's decision, and I believe he may not have fully understood what he was doing. Mother, Patricia said, though her tone suggested she was pleased rather than cautioning. No, Patricia, this needs to be said. Eleanor fixed me with a stare that could have frozen water. Charles was ill for a very long time. Pain medication, chemotherapy, the stress of knowing he was dying, these things affect judgment. I think he may have been confused about your role in our family. One of Patricia's friends, a sharp-featured brunette, leaned forward slightly. It must be so overwhelming, suddenly having all this responsibility. Managing a construction company, maintaining a property like this, handling Charles's business relationships. Have you given any thought to simplifying things? I understood now. This wasn't a social visit. It was an intervention, designed to make me feel so overwhelmed and out of place that I'd voluntarily give up the inheritance. They'd probably rehearsed this, planned exactly how to make me feel small and inadequate. And it was working. Sitting in Charles's beautiful parlor, surrounded by women who belonged to a world I'd never been part of, I felt every bit the fraud they thought I was. What did I know about running a construction company? How could I possibly maintain a historic mansion? Maybe they were right. Maybe Charles had been confused, and I was just too selfish to admit it. But then I noticed something. On the mantelpiece behind Eleanor's head was a photograph I'd never seen before Charles and me from last Christmas, sitting at his dining room table after dinner, both of us laughing at something one of us had said. He looked happy. Really, genuinely happy in a way I'd rarely seen in photos of him with his biological family. You know, I said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, I've been thinking about Charles's decision too. Patricia's eyes sharpened. This wasn't the response she'd expected, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. Charles was one of the smartest people I've ever met. He built a successful business from nothing, raised 2 children, maintained this beautiful home for over 50 years. The idea that he was somehow confused or manipulated is honestly insulting to his memory. Eleanor's face flushed slightly. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. I stood up, and suddenly the room felt different. I wasn't the supplicant anymore, begging for acceptance from people who would never give it. I was the homeowner, and they were guests in my house. You're suggesting that Charles was either too sick to make rational decisions or too stupid to see through some imaginary manipulation. Either way, you're dishonoring the man who loved you enough to leave you well provided for despite your obvious lack of affection for him. The blonde woman gasped slightly. Patricia's friends weren't used to being spoken to directly, especially not by someone they considered beneath them socially. I understand that you're upset, I continued. But Charles made his choice, and it was a deliberate one. He left me this inheritance because he believed I would use it well, not because I tricked him or seduced him or any of the other ugly things I'm sure you've been suggesting to anyone who will listen. Patricia stood up abruptly. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth. Charles loved his family, but he wasn't blind to your flaws. He knew exactly how you felt about him, just like he knew exactly how you felt about me. And he made his decision accordingly. The silence that followed was electric with tension. I could see the calculations happening behind Patricia's eyes, the realization that their carefully planned intervention had backfired completely. This isn't over, she said quietly as they prepared to leave. Charles may have left you his money, but you'll never be accepted in this community. You'll always be the outsider who stole a family's inheritance." After they left, I walked through the empty mansion, my footsteps echoing in the grand rooms. Patricia's words stung, because they held a grain of truth. I would always be an outsider in Savannah's established social circles. But for the first time, I wondered if that might actually be a blessing. That evening, I called Judge Harper at home. "I need to know everything about the business," I said. "How it operates, who the key employees are, what Charles's vision was for its future. If I'm going to own it, I'm going to run it properly." There was a pause, and then I heard something that sounded like pride in his voice. "I was hoping you'd say that." Charles left detailed notes about his hopes for the company's expansion. "I think you're going to find them very interesting." As I hung up the phone, I realized that somewhere between walking into Judge Harper's office as Thomas's wife and standing up to Eleanor Montgomery in my own parlor, I had started becoming someone new. Someone Charles had seen potential in, someone who deserved the opportunities he'd given me. The old Rebecca would have apologized, handed over the keys, and slunk back to her safe, small life. But that Rebecca was gone, left behind in the ruins of a marriage to a man who had never seen her value and a family that had never wanted her anyway. The new Rebecca was just getting started. 6 months after the will reading, I stood in the construction trailer that served as Montgomery and Sons' main office, looking at architectural plans for what would become the Rebecca Montgomery Literacy Center. The autumn morning was crisp, with that particular quality of light that made Savannah's Spanish moss look like nature's own crystal chandelier. "The foundation's scheduled to break ground next week," said Jennifer Williams, the project manager who'd become my closest ally in learning the construction business. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd worked for Charles for 15 years and had been skeptical of me at first. Now, she was one of my strongest supporters. The reading garden should be beautiful once the landscaping is finished. I studied the plans, still amazed that I was looking at blueprints for a dream that had only existed in my imagination 6 months ago. The Literacy Center would serve both children and adults, with separate wings for different age groups, a community meeting space, and an outdoor area designed for reading and small group activities. It was ambitious, expensive, and exactly what Charles had somehow known I would want to build. "Mrs. Montgomery?" Jennifer's voice pulled me back to the present. It still felt strange to be called that, not because I'd changed my name back after the divorce, but because now it meant something different. Now it carried weight and respect instead of tolerance and obligation. "Sorry, I was just thinking." I rolled up the plans carefully. "How are the other projects coming along?" Montgomery and Sons had been struggling before Charles's death, partly due to his illness and partly due to increased competition from larger firms. But under new management, meaning me, with heavy guidance from Jennifer and the other senior employees, we'd pivoted toward projects that aligned with my values. Instead of just chasing the biggest contracts, we now specialized in community development, affordable housing, and restoration of historic buildings. It had been a risk. Patricia had been quick to spread rumors that I was running Charles's legacy into the ground with my bleeding heart liberal agenda. But the numbers told a different story. We were booked solid for the next 18 months, had hired 6 new employees, and were being courted by the city for a major affordable housing development. "The community center downtown is ahead of schedule," Jennifer reported. "And the Historic Preservation Society wants to meet next week about the Victorians on Whitaker Street." The bell above the trailer door chimed, and I looked up to see Thomas walking in. 6 months of divorce proceedings, and his mother's influence had not been kind to him. He looked older, harder somehow, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Hello, Rebecca." His voice was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Jennifer." "Thomas." I kept my voice equally neutral. Our divorce had been finalized 2 months ago, and this was only the 3rd time I'd seen him since then. "What can I do for you?" He glanced at Jennifer, who made no move to leave. Whatever privacy he'd been hoping for wasn't going to happen in a room where I felt comfortable and confident. "I wanted to discuss the house," he said finally. "Our house. The ranch house." I'd been wondering when this conversation would happen. The ranch house had been in both our names, but I'd signed it over to him as part of the divorce settlement. It had seemed fair at the time. He needed somewhere to live, and I certainly didn't need 2 houses. "What about it?" "I can't afford the mortgage payments." The admission clearly cost him. Since the divorce, with just my income, I'm 3 months behind, and the bank is starting foreclosure proceedings. I studied his face, looking for the man I'd once loved enough to marry. He was still there, underneath the bitterness and wounded pride, but he felt like a stranger now. Someone from a different life, when I'd been a different person. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said and meant it. "What are you asking me to do?" "Buy it from me, for what I owe on it. I know it's not worth that much, but—" His voice trailed off. We both knew what he was really asking. He wanted me to bail him out, to use Charles's money to solve a problem that was entirely of his own making. "Thomas," I said gently, "you know I can't do that." "Can't!" His composure cracked slightly. "Rebecca, you inherited over $3 million. The mortgage balance is $97,000. That's pocket change to you now." Jennifer cleared her throat uncomfortably and started gathering papers from her desk. "I'll be outside checking on the crew," she said tactfully. After she left, the silence stretched between us. Through the trailer windows, I could see the construction workers arriving for their shifts, the normal rhythms of honest work continuing regardless of the personal drama playing out inside. "It's not about the money," I said finally. "It's about why you're asking." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Because I need help. Because despite everything that's happened between us, we were married for 8 years. That has to count for something. It does count for something, but not for this." I leaned against Jennifer's desk, trying to find the right words. "Thomas, in 8 years of marriage, you never once asked my opinion about a major financial decision. You never consulted me about investments or purchases or career changes. I was your wife, but I wasn't your partner." "That's not—" "Yes, it is. And now that you need something from me, suddenly you want to invoke those 8 years as if they were 8 years of mutual respect and collaboration. But they weren't." The color rose in Thomas's cheeks. "So this is revenge? You're punishing me because our marriage wasn't perfect." "No, Thomas. I'm protecting myself from being used again." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they needed to be said. "You're not asking me to help because you think I'm a good person who deserves to be treated with kindness. You're asking because I have something you want, just like your family asked me to give up the inheritance because they wanted something I had." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the construction site. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more like the man I'd married. "You've changed." "Yes, I have. Charles gave me the freedom to become who I was supposed to be all along." "And who's that?" I thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, I would have defined myself in relation to other people: Thomas's wife, Patricia's sister-in-law, Charles's daughter-in-law. Now those relationships were either gone or fundamentally altered. "Someone who builds things instead of just maintaining them," I said finally. "Someone who makes decisions based on what's right rather than what's expected. Someone who doesn't apologize for taking up space in the world." Thomas nodded slowly, and for a moment I saw something that might have been respect in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for how I treated you, for what I said at the will reading, for all of it." The apology surprised me. I'd been prepared for anger, manipulation, even threats. I hadn't been prepared for genuine remorse. "I'm sorry too," I said, "for both of us. We weren't right for each other, but we didn't have to hurt each other as much as we did." He left without another word about the house, and I knew he wouldn't ask again. Whatever happened with the foreclosure, he would handle it himself. Maybe that was what he needed to figure out how to solve his own problems instead of expecting someone else to do it for him. Jennifer came back in a few minutes later, tactfully not asking what the conversation had been about. We spent the rest of the morning going over schedules and budgets, the comfortable routine of work helping to settle my emotions after the unexpected encounter with Thomas. It was just after lunch when Judge Harper called. "Rebecca, I have some news that might interest you. The City Council is looking for someone to chair the new Historic Preservation and Community Development Committee. It's a volunteer position, but it comes with significant influence over development projects in the historic district." I almost laughed. 6 months ago, I'd been a third-grade teacher married to a struggling businessman, invisible to Savannah's power structure. Now I was being courted for civic leadership positions. Who suggested me? Actually, it was Mayor Williams. She's been impressed with Montgomery and Sons community-focused projects. She thinks you bring a fresh perspective to development issues. Mayor Williams was Jennifer's sister, I realized. The construction business was a small world in Savannah, and word traveled fast when someone was doing good work. What would it involve? Monthly meetings, reviewing proposed developments for historical compliance, making recommendations about city contracts. The position has a lot of potential influence over how Savannah grows over the next decade. After I hung up, I sat in the construction trailer thinking about paths not taken and futures I'd never imagined. A year ago, the most important decision I made on any given day was which books to read to my third-grade class. Now I was being asked to help shape the development of one of America's most beautiful historic cities. The Literacy Center groundbreaking was scheduled for the following month, with Mayor Williams doing the honors. Local news stations had expressed interest in covering it, not just because of the project itself, but because of the story behind it, the woman who'd inherited a fortune and used it to give back to the community. Patricia's prediction had been partially right. I would never be fully accepted by Savannah's old guard, the families who'd been here for generations and saw newcomers as temporary inconveniences. But I was discovering that there was another Savannah working families, recent transplants, young professionals, artists, and activists that was more interested in what you contributed than where you came from. That evening, I walked through the mansion's empty rooms, still getting used to the space and silence. I kept most of Charles's furniture, but I'd added touches that made it feel more like home photographs from my teaching years, plants in the sunroom, books scattered on tables where I'd been reading them. In Charles's study, my study now, I found the letter he'd left for me and read it again as I did most nights. Be brave, Rebecca. The world needs more people like you in positions where they can make a real difference. I was starting to understand what he'd meant. The inheritance wasn't just about money or property. It was about opportunity, the chance to use resources and influence to create positive change. Charles had spent 40 years building wealth. Now it was my job to figure out how to use that wealth meaningfully. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Jennifer calling from home. I just got off the phone with my sister, she said, excitement clear in her voice. The mayor wants to fast-track the affordable housing project. If we can have preliminary plans ready by next month, the city will commit to breaking ground before winter. Affordable housing had been one of my first initiatives after taking over the business. Savannah's rapid gentrification was pushing working families out of the city, and I'd proposed a development that would provide quality, affordable homes while preserving the architectural character of the neighborhoods. That's incredible news, I said. Do we have the capacity? If we bring in some subcontractors, absolutely. Rebecca, this could be huge for us. And more importantly, it could be huge for the families who need decent housing they can actually afford. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about Thomas's visit that morning. His accusation that I'd changed wasn't wrong, but it wasn't complete either. The core of who I was, someone who cared about education, community, and helping people build better lives, hadn't changed at all. What had changed was my ability to act on those values in meaningful ways. Charles had seen that potential in me when I couldn't see it in myself. He'd given me the tools to become someone who could make a real difference, not just in individual lives like I had as a teacher, but in systems and communities. Standing in the study where Charles had made the decision to leave me everything, I finally understood his gift completely. It wasn't just money or property or business assets. It was the chance to discover what I was capable of when I wasn't limited by other people's expectations or my own fears. The Literacy Center would open next fall. The affordable housing project would provide homes for dozens of families. Montgomery & Sons was thriving under leadership that prioritized community impact over pure profit, and I was being asked to help guide Savannah's development in ways that honored both its history and its future. None of it would have been possible if Charles hadn't seen past the quiet schoolteacher to the person I had the potential to become. His greatest gift wasn't the inheritance itself, but his faith that I would use it well. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to the master bedroom that still felt too grand for someone like me, I made a mental note to visit Charles's grave the next day. I wanted to tell him about the housing project, about Thomas's visit, about the committee appointment. I wanted to thank him again for seeing something in me that I'm only now beginning to see in myself. But mostly, I wanted to tell him that his faith hadn't been misplaced, that the quiet woman who'd sat at his Sunday dinner table was gone, replaced by someone braver, stronger, and more determined to make a difference in the world. Someone worthy of the name Rebecca Montgomery.